On today's show, a bonus pod on a Monday during the day, reacting to some rumors from Charania of The Athletic, the latest stuff on the Hawks rumor mill, John Collins, Clint Capela, and more coming up.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1264 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland. It is Monday afternoon, actually kind of midday as I am recording this, a special bonus edition of the podcast, a rare day off for me from the day job. And we got a slew of new rumblings from Charania of The Athletic on Monday morning. It is officially that time. If you missed it, by the way, I dropped a new mailbag podcast Sunday evening into Monday morning for your Monday morning commute. All of that is still relevant at this point in time. So listen to that podcast as well as we had 6 shows last week. Yes, 6 shows last week, including a 2-part conversation that I had with Brian Schroeder on the NBA draft, and Glenn Willis is joining me recently, some solo podcasts, etc. It's a great time to subscribe and listen to the podcast across platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, etc., and leave a 5-star rating. And I really appreciate all the support already on the podcast. I will say, as we get into all of what was reported from Shams on Monday morning, it is officially silly season at this point in time. The majority of the rumors, quote unquote, or the rumblings, however you want to say that, are leaked from somewhere. They're posturing in some cases. And I would not just take all of this as gospel, but whenever someone like Shams reports anything, it becomes very big sort of newsy stuff for Hawks fans, and it prompts a lot of questions. I'm going to try to answer a bunch of them. This is not a mailbag podcast, but I got a ton of questions immediately after this rumors and after the report that was out there. So I'm going to address all of that stuff and my own thoughts about what was reported on this sort of bonus edition. I won't be able to do this for every single news drop in the next few days, but again, as I mentioned before, it's a rare off day for me from the day job, so I had some time to go ahead and sift through this. We have some guests lined up later in the week, so I wanted to go ahead and knock it out now. So first thing comes involving John Collins. Not a huge surprise. There's been a lot of rumors recently, but it involves the Sacramento Kings. The reporting from Shams was that the Kings are, quote, becoming increasingly comfortable drafting at number 4 overall in the draft. So that's not really a Hawks thing, but later on, it was reported that Monte McNair, their general manager, has, quote, engaged in conversations around Hawks forward John Collins, end quote, but there has been no involvement of the number 4 pick in those discussions centered on Collins, and McNair is going to be making a decision on the pick for the Kings. So one of the pet theories of Hawks fans, I think Andrew Kelly talked about it on my show, I referenced it a few times, would be a Hawks swap of Collins for number 4 to try to take an upside swing on Jaden Ivey, for instance. But in this rumor, that's not going to be on the table. A lot of people asking me what the Hawks would be wanting from the Kings if it was not the number 4 pick. And I do understand that. For me, again, as a reminder, I talked about this a lot on the show earlier today, or I guess it was Sunday night, was that I am not in the camp of trying to trade John Collins. I'm just kind of viewing this through the prism of the Hawks, at least taking offers from him and kind of just couching it in that I'm still high on Collins, etc. Now, for me, the easy way to get value for Collins that's appropriate would be the number 4 pick. But if that's off the table from the Kings, then there are other options. I think it's always important to keep in mind that matching salary is a thing. The Kings are not a cap team necessarily, so they have to match salary on this transaction if it were to happen. And Collins, just for the record, makes $23.5 million for next season. That's an appropriate sum, but that's what you have to match off of if you are the Kings. The easiest way to get there for Sacramento would be Harrison Barnes. So that answers the question. The easy way, Sands number 4 pick, to get value for Collins would be to center a package around Harrison Barnes. Now, to be very clear, John Collins is better than Harrison Barnes, and he's younger. He's signed for longer, etc. So I would not swap Collins for Barnes one-on-one. But obviously, Barnes is a very useful player. Combo forward type would help the Hawks in some ways, not necessarily the same ways as Collins, but if they want to make a change, that would be a way to do it. The Kings apparently still want to keep Barnes as they try to win this year, which I'm not really sure why they're trying to do that, but alas, that's the Kings. But for me, any deal that does not involve number 4 pretty much has to involve Harrison Barnes. There are ways to do it without him, but there not be enticing ways for me, at least that are not pretty obvious at this point in time. So Barnes makes about $18.35 million. And, he's not going to change your life, but he's a two-way forward. He can play a little defense. He's a good shot creator for himself, a little bit probably more so than Collins is, less of a finisher than Collins, obviously. And I think Collins might be a better defender at this point, more of a big Collins is, of course, than Barnes is more of a true combo forward type. But A different player, but still a very useful one. And I think Barnes is a quality starter still at this point in his career. He is only signed for one more season, so that's part of the calculus as well. That might matter to you long term. But Barnes would be the centerpiece, presumably, if it was not number 4 overall pick. Other than that, the guys on the Kings roster, I should say, that the Hawks would be maybe interested in on some level, either for salary matching purposes or for intrigue purposes, would be Davion Mitchell, who was their lottery pick from 2 years ago. A guy that I was not super high on in the draft, but certainly someone who has some value. He's making about $4.8 million right now, and I'm not sure what his fit is long term with the Kings, especially if they were to draft Ivy at number 4. But Mitchell is a guy who is not a throw-in, though. Like, that's a guy the Kings would want to get value for in this deal or any deal. And then you have other salary matching pieces like Justin Holiday, who's making about $6.3 million. Holiday is a rotation caliber wing that might help the Hawks from a depth perspective. I think that he would certainly give them a quality fourth wing. That's kind of what I think of Holiday, is like not a guy you want to start, but certainly on a good team, he'd be a good fourth wing option, making reasonable money. You have Mo Harkless at $4.5 million, kind of similar, more of a combo forward than Holiday, who is more of a wing. But Harkless is another guy who can be in your rotation, maybe be that backup forward type that we talked about a little bit yesterday on the show, actually. Either behind Collins or alongside Jalen Johnson, et cetera. He might be that kind of veteran option in that. Also, the Kings have all of their own first-round picks moving forward, 2023 and beyond, and they had the 37th pick this year, which has some value. So I'm not going to do a full fake trade here from the Kings and Collins, but for me, the only way that it gets interesting if I am the Hawks and not number four overall would be Barnes and some substantial stuff alongside Barnes, whether it's Barnes and Mitchell or Barnes and a future first-round pick. Something like that, you could say, makes appropriate value sense. I personally would not be in love with that kind of swap, but I do understand the thought process behind it. And Barnes is a good player who's making less than Collins for less time. So if you're worried about the future finances, as I'm sure Tony might be, that might be part of the calculus as well. I don't think that the Kings would do Barnes and Mitchell for Collins. If I had to guess, they probably value Mitchell at a high level. But that would be what I'd be asking for if I'm the Hawks. If you want to just marry yourself to this kind of talk, that would be the way to do it. So just to answer all the questions that I was getting about why the Hawks might do this, I don't know if they will. That's important here. Again, this is kind of silly season stuff. Maybe the Hawks are taking calls, but not necessarily looking to move him to the Kings in particular. But if you cross 4 off the board, it kind of has to be Harrison Barnes and something else for me. There might be a way to get to the salary to match with Richaun Holmes and Holiday or something like that. But Richaun Holmes as a center does not have a lot of value to the Hawks. That's a pretty negative value in terms of like what you'd be taking back. So maybe there's a way to do like a Holmes Holiday plus like 2 or 3 more assets for Collins, but that's more of a dump move that you might do as like a rebuilding team. I would not love that if I was the Hawks. So there are ways to do it matching salary wise, but for me, the cleanest way, sans number 4, would be Barnes and other stuff. Okay. Before we get to the rest of the podcast, a word from our friends at betonline.ag. And the NBA season is not over, of course. The fun never stops at BetOnline. There are plenty of stuff to focus on always in the sports world. And with that as a backdrop, BetOnline is the number one source for all of your sports betting needs and sports information. This year, they have the latest odds and news and developments. That includes the Stanley Cup Finals, which are ongoing at this point in time. They have baseball stuff, odds, scores, lines, etc. They have the latest fight stuff, and even next season's NFL, college football, and college basketball futures. I talked a lot about NBA futures on the last podcast, which is certainly available for your consumption at BetOnline. And they have other stuff in the wagering space that includes live betting and esports. They have poker, and they have casino games and more. And the other sports that you might be interested in are all covered at BetOnline. I mentioned before hockey, but they have golf and tennis, auto racing, horse racing. They have soccer, cricket, entertainment bets, and any sport you could possibly think of, table tennis, etc. Head to BetOnline right now on your computer mobile device to learn more about all of the trends and the action across the sports world. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, more to get to from the Shams reporting on Monday morning. This is sort of the lowest profile item, but he mentions that Hawks free agent guard Lou Williams is going to intend to continue playing. And he quotes his agent, Wallace Prather, saying that Lou is not pursuing retirement and he'll be proactive in talking to teams during free agency, end quote. So this is not hugely surprising, but certainly a little bit surprising. I thought Lou was probably going to retire if I had to guess. He still might, by the way. I don't say this to be negative, but he was not very good this year. That was kind of pretty obvious, I think, to most people. But he'll be 36 in October. I've always been a fan of Lou. I definitely wish him the best long term. I'm not somebody who wants to play. But all of the reporting and what he's leaked out and what he's even said on the record is that he's not a guy who wants to just go anywhere to play, usually. Now, that might have changed. Maybe he just likes playing, wants to be around, etc. But in the recent past, like there was some rumblings from him that he considered retirement when he was traded to Atlanta. That's not that long ago. And I think he's not a guy who wants to go to most markets to play. There's been some buzz out there that he kind of only wants to play in like LA and Atlanta at this point. I mean, he spent so much time in LA. Obviously, he's from Atlanta, but he could get a minimum from a team, I'm pretty sure, if he was willing to go wherever that might take him. Now, he could sign a minimum with like the Clippers or Lakers. That wouldn't stun me either. Those are veteran teams that want to win now. I'm not sure how much value he still has on the court. Again, he was not very good this year, but maybe as a third point guard type veteran presence at the minimum could be interesting for a team or two. The Hawks, of course, also could sign him if they want. I would be surprised if that happened. I think that Nate does like Lou, but I think it did not go super well. By the end of the season, you might remember that Lou was he was hurt, but it was kind of a weird situation where he was just like no updates happening on him. He just was, he was around the team, but he was not playing. And I think they kind of pulled the plug a little bit there at the end of the season. So we'll see where that lands. It wouldn't stun me if he was playing next year. It wouldn't stun me if he was retired next year. But for now, he's at least not retiring. He was at least looking for a team for next year. And again, I would be surprised if it's the Hawks, but they have the ability to sign him if they want to. He's, of course, a local product that has some ties to Nate, etc. Last thing that Sean's reported, and this is probably the newest / most intriguing of the Nuggets, is that the Timberwolves have discussed deals around veteran centers. That's quoting Shams, and that includes Atlanta's own Clint Capela. So this is interesting in that the Wolves have Karl Anthony Towns on the roster, who is an All-NBA level center. But obviously, that might indicate that they're willing to play him at the 4 a lot more. As I talked to Glenn Willis, friend of the podcast, he mentioned to me, and I've noticed this as well, Towns played a decent amount of 4 last year as well. He's a guy who's capable of playing there. So maybe the Wolves, under new management with Tim Connolly, want to go a little bit bigger, have Cat play a little bit more 4, and have a more quality starting center next to him. Plus, Capela is an awesome defender, anchor, rebounder, etc. Ironically, the Wolves were part of that giant 4-way deal that got Capela to the Hawks in the first place. They didn't touch that, but it was an interesting kind of swap there. They were involved in that. As discussed on the last mailbag on Sunday, Capela is owed about $18.2 million for this coming season, and then about $43 million combined over the next 2 after that. So a 3-year deal basically remaining for Capela. So with any deal, again, the Wolves do not have cap space. This is a salary matching exercise. If the Wolves want to get involved with Capela, it could be a 3-team deal as well. But again, there's a whole subplot about whether they want to play Towns at the 4, but it's a Wolves podcast kind of thing. But Capela would anchor their defense for sure. There are some interesting options for the Wolves to potentially trade with the Hawks. I'm just going to name them in descending order of money. One is that they have D'Angelo Russell, who's making about $31 million this year. That's a lot of money on a 1-year contract. We'll get back to the fit stuff in a second. Then they have Malik Beasley, a local Atlanta product, $15.5 million for next year, and then a team option for the following season. Then they have Patrick Beverley at about $13 million, expiring a 1-year deal for Pat Bev. Then they have a bunch of guys who are a little bit cheaper, but are also kind of interesting as additions to the deal. Jared Vanderbilt, about $4.3 million. Jaden McDaniels at about $1.9 million. Naz Reid at about $1.9 million guaranteed. And then the Wolves have the number 19 overall pick in the draft as well. They have 3 second-round picks. They have all their future first-round picks as well. So that's a wide berth of what could be included for a Capela deal. Obviously, they're not going to trade Karl Anthony Towns or Anthony Edwards, so I'm not even going to mention those guys. But everybody else, in theory, would be available that is signed with the Wolves, and it's kind of those 5 players: Russell, Beasley, Beverly, McDaniels, and Reed. That's 6 players that could be at least kind of interesting in some ways. Now, I'm not going to do a full deep dive here, but people were asking about Russell right away. Russell's a good player. He's not my favorite player. And also, that's a lot of money, even if it's a 1-year deal. And for me, him and Trae Young do not fit particularly well together. Now, he would address the secondary creation that the Hawks have been looking for reportedly. He would be their best shot creator on the perimeter that they've had in the Trae Young era, other than Trae, of course. But defensively, that's kind of a catastrophe. Russell is not a great athlete either. That's not something I want to do probably long-term, even short-term. Now, I do get it. And maybe they want to shed the long-term salary or whatever. But in the short term, with the Hawks pressing up against the luxury tax, Russell makes considerably more than Capela, like more than $10 million more than Capela next year. That's a tough sell. So it had to be Capela and something else, whatever. Anyway, I would not be interested in that. Not sure about the Hawks, but Russell would be a guy that could conceivably want, in theory. More probably likely would be something like either using Malik Beasley or Pat Beverly as the salary ballast in this kind of deal. Beasley is a reasonable contract. at $15.5 million with a team option. But the problem there would be that he is basically a pure shooting guard in the same way that Kevin Huerter and Bogdanovich are both pure shooting guards. Now, those guys could be moved in separate deals. That's possible as well. But on the current roster, Beasley doesn't really do much for you. He's not someone you can play at the three. Like obviously the Hawks will use another wing, but they don't want another 6'5", pure two defensive weakness kind of shooting guard on their roster probably. And that's what he is at this point. Obviously a high-end shooter and a pretty interesting guy to match salary with, but not the greatest, cleanest fit at this point. Beverly would help them in some ways as a good defender, veteran presence, short-term deal, but he is on the older side and also it's expiring. So if you want to keep that salary slot, Beverly would not be terribly interesting. And I think they'd probably value him as well. But I think that as sort of a antagonist, tough guy, can shoot it a little bit, play off the ball next to Trey, guard point guards. He's an interesting fit and a pretty decent salary matching guy. So if you keep that in mind, $13 million, Beverly plus something else, whether it be Vanderbilt, McDaniels, Reed, would get you to enough salary to swap Capela back. Whether you want to do that or not is another conversation. Because personally, I would not be interested in a Beverly throw-in guy for Capela kind of deal in terms of value. Now, McDaniels is probably the most interesting guy of the Wolves. I do like him quite a bit as a value at what he's making now, especially in a young player, pretty interesting player. I probably would not do a Beverly McDaniels for Capela swap, but if you go like Beverly McDaniels and a pick for Capela, that's pretty interesting in some ways. Again, a lot of this is contingent on what they do at center. Whether they're ready to hand it over to Okongwu is an open question at this point in time. Obviously, they've been linked heavily to Ayton and Gobert. Maybe if you are linked to those guys and you want to trade for those guys without sending Capela in those deals, maybe you get the Wolves involved, send Capela there to where you already have invested now in Gobert or Ayton in a swap. So these are all, keep in mind, these are all like moving parts on the chessboard. Capela just being sent out without a center coming back is a deal that like really kind of marries you to Okongwu, which is fine. Okongwu's a really good player, but maybe you want Naz Reid in that deal as a backup center. Maybe you want another option like that, or maybe you want to acquire a backup center another way, etc. So there's lots of moving pieces, but it doesn't stun me that Capela has trade value. I talked about that a little bit on the show yesterday, but Capela, at least now, has officially been linked to a team for the first time in this kind of form. I would say the Hornets have been a theoretical fit for Capela for a while, as they don't have a center defensively in particular. And Capela could be moved very easily if they wanted to. The question is whether they actually want to do that and just kind of hand the reins over to Okongwu or as part of a big swap for one of the more high-profile centers. So time will tell on all that. But there are options there. There are options on the Kings deal. There's stuff out there. I'm not saying I'm married to any of this stuff because I'm really not. I would not be looking to trade Collins in the way that some might be looking to trade Collins. Capela is a little bit more interesting. I've talked about that extensively in the last few months, both on the Capela deep dive that I did with Glenn Willis, Okongwu, etc. I think Capela is still really good, but there is an argument for sure for handing it over to Okongwu at this point in time. You invested in him so highly as a top half of the lottery draft pick a couple years ago. He's proven some stuff at this point, so that's a pretty interesting hypothetical. But you have to match salary, and there are always moving parts. And there's a new management in Minnesota, which kind of adds to the intrigue there from as Conley goes over from Denver to Minnesota. Okay, that's all I got on these little rumblings. Nothing has risen to the level of a 5-alarm fire just yet. And usually I wouldn't do like an emergency podcast. That's not really what this is, more of a bonus to kind of check in to give my thoughts on all of these rumblings. But here we are. There'll be more of this stuff, I'm sure, in the coming hours and days. The draft is like 80 hours away as I record this midday on Monday, so 3+ days away. And it's going to be fast and furious coming. They could make a deal before the draft. They can make a deal on draft night. They could do nothing on draft night and just make their picks. We will see on all that stuff. But please subscribe to the podcast. Tell a friend about the show. And we'll definitely see you later on this week. So please stay tuned. We'll see you next time.